Thank you. I remember that period because the conceptualization and design of the event had a time context. If you recall, in 2007, the UN General Assembly had passed a resolution declaring 2nd October, the birth anniversary of the Mahatma, as International Day of Non-Violence. So this was 2007. Also, 50 years earlier, Martin Luther King Jr. had visited India. So 2009 was the 140th birth anniversary of the Mahatma, and it was also the 50th year celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit to India. So I recall clearly that when we started planning for the event, the South African ambassador, the US PR, Susan Rice, and we had an initial discussion, and the UN very aptly, I think, and very appropriate for the event, 2 years after the declaration of the International Day of Non-Violence, decided to bring out a stamp. Now, the event in terms of time context had significance, but more than that, I think the release of that UN stamp also in a sense captured the wide resonance that the Mahatma's message had for the work of the UN. Let me try and contextualize this a bit. What is well known is the fact that the UN itself was conceived during a 3-month period whilst the Second World War was still raging. So the apostle of non-violence, Ahimsa, a stamp in his honor when the UN was going through a difficult time, I would say, in many, many respects. That resonates in the first pillar, peace and security. But you will also recall that that was the period around which we were finishing the work on the Millennium Development Goals. And that's when we were starting the work on the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, if you look at the message of the Mahatma, quite apart from the work he did in South Africa, and my friend, the South African ambassador, used to often tell me that, you sent us an English-educated lawyer, somebody educated at University College London, called to the bar in a temple. But he developed a philosophy, a program of action for the independence of nations. So when he was dealing with racial discrimination and apartheid, in many ways, that previsioned the human rights agenda. So that is one. But in 2009, something very different, something very interesting was happening. When you were finishing the MDGs and beginning to start conceptualizing the Sustainable Development Goals, very different from the MDGs where work was done in a think tank, OECD, brought in from the top. The SDGs was grassroots level, bottoms up. And I can tell you that the SDGs basic philosophy, to the farthest first, actually captures the Mahatma's essential core of his teachings. That is from Sarvodaya to Antyodaya, that is again to reach out to the poorest of the poor. So when we look at that period, if I were to write a history of the period, I would say that after its establishment, its coming into being during the period of the Second World War, it had a great record in terms of peacekeeping. As far as India is concerned, I think we participated in something like 41 out of the 70 major peacekeeping exercises, where our engineers, our doctors, Then sometime around 2009, I don't remember the exact year, maybe in 2007 or 8, we sent the first FPU, all women police force, and I remember visiting them in Liberia, if my memory serves me right. So you have several things related where Mahatma Gandhi actually, both in terms of the human rights agenda, in terms of the peace and security first pillar, and then the development pillar which was coming in. So, and the artist himself, I don't know if you are aware of this, he was Muhammad Ali's physician, but with deep knowledge of medical science and dealing with the human condition, he painted the the picture of the Mahatma in very striking colors. So I remember the event. I think it was one of my moments which one will cherish for a long time. Susan Rice spoke at the event. Others spoke at the event. I just made some jottings from what was said then. And I think Susan Rice said Gandhi had influenced millions of Americans. Gandhi believed that physical force could be turned aside by moral force. Now, a message like that has a relevance not only when Gandhiji implemented his work, when Martin Luther King visited India Junior in 1959, but even now, to this date. And what Martin Luther King said, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. So I think the message which the stamp gave, one is an event, Let's face it, UN, there is a lot of activity, a lot of events take place. We remember some because they capture and they have the genius of capturing the flavor, the occupation, they capture the mood. I think that 2009 event was one of those. And I'm so happy that the SDGs were negotiated. Mahatma Gandhi was a great advocate of women's empowerment. I'm very happy that a few years later, as a vice president of the assembly, I was called upon to complete the final round of negotiation for the establishment of UN Women. And I was presiding over that process. And we produced a new entity which today is, a very significant part of the UN's system and functioning. I think as we go forward, and then came the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. And as we are implementing the SDGs, there are so many in which the Mahatma's, I wouldn't say footprint, but he captures what needed to be done. Let me recall for you one of the flagship programs that my ministry is currently implementing. The Prime Minister said, speaking from the ramparts of the Red Fort on 15th August 2014, he had just been elected in May. He said that the most befitting tribute we can pay the Mahatma when we celebrate the 150th birth anniversary would be to declare India open defecation free. I know some of my friends said, is this a message which should come from the Prime Minister? Let me tell you, we have 5 major flagship programs implemented or anchored in the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. I think this is the most important. And today when India is 99.9% open defecation free, I'm still not declaring it 100% because West Bengal, one state in India, has still got some reporting to do. And because of the COVID pandemic, we haven't been able to complete that paperwork. But Mahatma Gandhi's influence is everywhere. And I think that stamp by the UN meant that the UN was acknowledging the role of this great man. Well, I must confess, I reached New York in 2008. A few months later, many months later, I realized that there was such thinking And I knew that I was made aware that they were zeroing in on who the artist for the stamp should be. Look, formally we were brought into the picture much later. We are talking about October 2009. So formally we came to know later. But you know, if you are an active PR, you find out what the conversations are. I don't think there was much of a debate, because there were 2 or 3 other names also, and then everybody, I think, came around to this. But this was essentially a choice made between the people who deserve the full credit in terms of the stamp. I mean, the US Postal Department and the UN. I mean, that's how this, I think it was a $1 denomination stamp, if I remember correctly. And it's, you know, iconic collector's items. So, look, first of all, if you situate India in terms of its global presence, it's always useful to remember that it's not just the Indians who live in India, but it's also, depending on what figure you want to use, 17.5 million people of Indian origin. They may or may not be Indian passport holders, but they have got very strong emotional umbilical roots to their mother country. They live in different parts of the world. And Gandhiji's first job, which took him to South Africa, saw the human condition that people were being subjected to. And the great human being in him then evolved first a personal and then a philosophical and political response, which was unique. Unique in the sense that if you really, and I'm an admirer of Gandhi, let me say that up front, it was designed to achieve objectives within the rule of law through peaceful civil disobedience or through satyagraha. But the idea was that, and the expectation was, that some good and some positive results could flow from those who were responsible for the governance structure. But I think his thinking changed. I think after Jallianwala Bagh and after other developments, the same Mahatma who was seeking support from Indians and other people around the world for the British war effort at the time of the First World War. Please remember that the history of this period is ensconced between the First and the Second World War. I mean, many of the conceptual linking of the Indian freedom movement from being essentially a peasant movement to their link with English-educated lawyers who founded the Congress Party, Annie Besant, Alan Octavian Hume. I mean, I'm just going back. That was a remarkable contribution. There were other streams. There was a Netaji Indian National Army streak also. But Gandhi was able to realize that. And I think that was a message not just for Indians subjected to that discrimination, but it became a template in the decolonization, in the freedom movements of other countries in the world. I am not sure as to what happened. I mean, I am a post-Second World War product. I mean, I was born 5 years after we became an independent country. But I think that the significance and importance of the Gandhi brand, and I'm choosing to use a commercial brand, was not sufficiently realized else in many places. I think one of the greatest contributions in terms of the Gandhian legacy is the fact that the Prime Minister, and that's his personal inspiration, now when you see my room anywhere, Gandhiji's specs, it's a symbol. And the Swachh Bharat mission and all the other associations that the Mahatma inspired, I think it has made a very strong impact not only on India, but India in the rest of the world. You know, we always, on our own, are conscious of the fact that we are a multilingual, multicultural, large society. Our civilizational ethos, I mean, Vasudhaiva Kudumpagam, the whole world is one. And then if you take it from there, and if you look at India's, the evolution of its polity as a democracy, multicultural, multilingual, it's not only an experiment in itself, but I think it holds a template for the rest of the world. Many of my cynical friends very often say, we're not growing as fast as X or we're not doing Y. But if you look at the nature of our society, the fault lines in here, make no mistake, caste, linguistic, etc. And the fact that we are able to reconcile those in a productive manner, leaving no one behind. And that's the other Gandhian philosophy, which is of course the sheet anchor of the Agenda 2030. But I think it also characterizes India's dealings with the world. So his elevation to sainthood in terms of being revered as a Mahatma, I think is well deserved, and it also has set the coordinates for India's interaction with the rest of the world. Well, it really depends on whom you're talking to. Look, if you're cynical or you don't want to value the Mahatma's contribution, but he has his critics, make no mistake. There are those who took a fairly dim view of the nature of British colonialism. I mean, what I'm talking about the economic exploitation element. And they say that, well, ultimately the Gandhian approach meant that you carried out a peaceful agitation, you set forth demands. If your demands were met, all right. Most often they were not met, in which case the Mahatma would be imprisoned, and that the movement did not develop into what our Marxian friends would call a revolutionary movement to overthrow the state. But you know, as a student of history and having been in public life now, I joined the Foreign Service in '74. I mean, 40 years or now 50 years later, I think it was the Gandhian approach which is the correct one. I mean, you can overthrow systems through force, and I've written a book on the use of force, sanctioning military force from the outside. What do you achieve? You achieve the dismemberment of countries. Countries get destroyed in that. The very fact that despite all our shortcomings, we have been able to maintain that civilizational ethos, both within the country and in our relations with the outside world, is a great tribute to this man. And I think it's not tokenism. I mean, it's tokenism if you don't believe in Gandhi, and if you are posted in New York or elsewhere, you attend an event, then you go about it with a manner in which you go about other events. But look, as a student of history in Delhi University, I came across a certain discovery for myself. And the more I read, the more I reflect on Gandhi, no matter which political philosophy you utilize to analyze the man, he's one of those truly remarkable people whom, at least for history for decades and I think centuries to come, will realize that this was a philosophy of political evolution and social this thing. Many of his economic ideas you may or not agree with, but when I start looking at what's happening in the pandemic, I mean, his economic ideas also don't seem to be too out of place. Maybe he was such a visionary, he was way ahead of all of us. So it's a very powerful tool. It's a very powerful tool. No, I mean, look, but you see, what are the instruments you have in diplomacy? I mean, I want to be very candid. The margin of persuasion is very limited. One of the first persons I came into contact with after I joined the Foreign Service as a probationer in 1974. He said in any given situation, the margin of persuasion is 5%. Which means what? Which means you come to the table with your set of demands, I come to the table with my set of demands. We negotiate bilaterally, it's give and take. When you go into a plurilateral setting, not 2 but 4, 5, again you try and work out what you call the issue-based coalitions. Like we may be of the same mind on trade, we may be of the same mind on this thing. You have a pandemic hit you, you want to go into broader this thing, you go to a specialized agency of the UN, the WHO, where you have a multilateral thing, all countries in the world, mostly one country, one vote. Who stands out there? I've always heard, this was the time it was intended as criticism when I was a young diplomat. I went on my first posting to Geneva as a first secretary, one of the 2 members on our delegation to the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Politically, that was a period of non-alignment. We had hosted, the summit in Delhi, Mrs. Gandhi had. And they said, well, a lot of people do a lot of talking, etc. And that ultimately everybody's aligned. But I think we managed by and large over a period of time to retain strategic autonomy in terms of our political relation. It doesn't mean that we can't be aligned with people for security or trade policy interests, etc., because there is a national interest to be pursued. I personally believe that the use of soft power as a larger backdrop is a much better instrument, is a much better approach than coming to the table and thumping your wristing or threatening the use of force, etc. Soft power takes many forms. Sometimes you don't need to use soft power. If a cultural way of life succeeds, in a lighter vein, COVID has certainly brought the Indian form of greeting. Indian other countries also, they fold their hands to welcome people, bow a little. But I think our soft power also, we have our critics, those who have political scores to settle with us, who may say other things, but our approach to the world is essentially anchored in humility, in tolerance, in adjustment, in seeking avenues for cooperation, both bilateral, plurilateral and multilateral, to enlarge the canvas for that basic philosophy that the world is one place. Very often, because relations between countries are governed by hard interest, it's not realized. But then you fast forward, you come to the current situation we find ourselves in, the pandemic. We distributed through Lifeline Udan, I'm giving you a personal example, 973 tons of medical supplies, medical equipment, PPE masks, ventilators to different parts of the country. We spent 30 tons outside. 500 million, God knows, other tablets of hydroxychloroquine or other things. We didn't ask who it was. We got requests. We got requests from our friends, we sent them abroad. Many, many years earlier, after the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, when the TRIPS agreement was negotiated, we had always then asked for a public interest, public health exception. Like if you were to face a pandemic, intellectual property at the end of the day is a balance between the need to reward creativity and public good. Now, are you going to allow your pharmaceutical companies to make huge profits to make the medicine so unaffordable that you will not be able to supply it to your common citizens. We have always gone for a balanced approach and for public good. I'm very happy, therefore, today when the narrative is that the Prime Minister said that we will procure in large quantities and make it available to the more vulnerable sections of our population first. This is all part of your software, your soft power or soft approach. I mean, first of all, when you use words like soft power, well, you know, Joseph Nye has written a book on it, I mean, if I remember correctly, many years ago. A lot of people have written. But those are particular aspects. But the civilizational ethos of a country, I believe, comes from the kind of mainstream core resonance that this finds inside. And I think that is India's soft power. You can individually take from that Bollywood, you can take yoga, you can take other things. But they all add up, I think, to a overall mosaic, which is the Indian civilizational ethos, which is not a country is 75 years old soon, but you know, 1947 to 2022, but you're a 5,000 to 7,000 year old civilization. And I think that's where it comes from. It's both. It's an expression of sovereign decision making. You decide what stamp you want to do, whom you want to honor. But you also acknowledge people from outside. I mean, when you do that, and the UN does it, UN introduces a stamp, it uses the US Postal Service or whatever. I mean, I don't want to get into it. Philately is important. But is it just something where it goes into a collector's collection of first day covers or etc.? It's one way of looking at it, but I also think it's a very powerful, if you write the history of a period, what are the dominant influences that you're going to write about? I happened to read a book some time ago, I'm sure you are familiar with it, The Intellectual History of the United Nations. If you look at the intellectual history of the United Nations, it brings out how the UN itself has been way ahead in terms of many of the dominant themes of this, human rights, for instance. Now, if you look at the overall intellectual history and you put individuals there, I think Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi will find pride of place in any such collection. India's relation with the UN have been very interesting. I've always said that I felt when I was India's PR in Geneva and in New York or secretary in Delhi, I've always felt that if there were to be a poll which the UN would be subjected to, one of the countries in the world where the UN would do exceptionally well would be India. Because by and large, the Indian view of the UN is benign, by and large, of large countries which have a more pronounced developmental challenge. I mean, let me explain to you. This whole politics of one country, one vote is all very well. But I remember a representative of the UN who used to be stationed in Delhi not too long back used to tell me, you know, if you get this experiment right, you've already got 1.34 billion people being used as a laboratory. Do you remember? And 1/6 of every person in the world is an Indian. You see how easy it becomes to replicate that. And you know, it's a statement he made in a context, a particular context. I think we were in a seminar, but it just set me thinking. That's precisely what Gandhi did. The approach he evolved to the evolution and attainment of India's independence is ultimately the model for decolonization and you know, freedom movements which went, ours was late 40s, you know, mid 40s to, I mean, you can start, let's say 1942 if you want to start, but even then we had the Khilafat movement, you had other this thing, but it went on till the 50s and 60s and so on. So I think the Indian experiment, see, India is also it's a country which I'm sure some of my friends don't find it easy to understand. There's an intensely spiritual part. There's also a very humane part. But there are parts of India also which have a very high level of intellectual development, contribution to science, contribution to medicine, indigenous systems, well-developed communities. I mean, we were talking about, if you look at the Harappa, Indus Valley civilization, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, you see all the features of what I deal with in terms of modern day, present day urban existence. Now, it's a country which had republics, what, 6th century BC? So it's a country which needs to be understood. And I mean, you can say that some of these were brought down from generation to generation through word of mouth. But it's a very rich cultural tradition. And it's also, I mean, it doesn't stop there. I mean, if you look at our startups, if you look at the kind of contributions that you make to Silicon Valley, somebody was half seriously sent me something on WhatsApp. You get a lot of exchange. You look up the list of CEOs throughout the world. I'm not talking about just the very well-known ones, the top 5 or 10. But you look at it, look into the top 100, you see a very large number of Indians, people who have done exceptionally well. So there must be something in that Indian genius. There has to be something there. Now, how do you nurture that? And how do you develop that? And I think it ultimately comes from the fact that you have an approach to life which finds resonance in your nature of governance domestically, and equally it's reflected in your relations with the outside world. That's, I think, where the UN and India have a very well-defined, positive cooperation agenda which suggests itself.